Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Some Civil War Poetry. My name is Vincent Hannum, and I'm coming to you live from the Central Standard Time in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Currently, the weather here is rainy, very cloudy. It's not a light rain, but it's not a thunderstorm. Somewhere in between. Interesting times. So I just wanted to let you know that we're here to read some history. Well, talk maybe some history, definitely read some poetry that could be of historical nature. Um, and like every morning, maybe try to glean some insight into see how people at the time felt about their world, and if there are any dots to connect to ours. At least in this version of the show, we're doing that poetically. And I'm drawing these poems from a book called Poetry of the Civil War. It's an anthology. It's a collection of half of the book is poems called the Blue, the Union side, the northern side, poets of a northern sympathetic nature, and the other side is the exact opposite, poets with a southern bent, whether or not they're Southern or Confederate themselves. So it's been an interesting contrast to see how these poets have approached the war through their words. Starting in the beginning, both sides were very, we're off to war. We'll be back in 3 weeks. Now things are, the tone is shifted a little bit. They're a little more dour in their tone. So it's been really, really interesting. Especially on the northern side, in terms of poets, we have covered a lot of the heavy hitters: Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. I've learned about some heavy hitters, a guy named John Greenleaf Whittier, who has shown up time and time again. Love that guy. And one poet whom we have read once, I'm very happy to say we are reading again. As I like to say, this guy's best friend of the pod, best friend of American literature, Walt Whitman. And he wrote a poem called The Wound Dresser, which honestly made me tear up like no other poem in this book has done. I was just struck by a certain frankness in his words. Nothing was flowery about it, super specific, super human. That poem was about a wound dresser, a nurse in a field hospital, and the actual day-to-day horrors, but also his job that he's describing. So definitely check that one out. It's in a past episode. And I'm very excited to read Walt Whitman again today. I'm so excited by Walt Whitman. I went out and bought Leaves of Grass over the weekend, and my fiance just kind of was like, who is an English major? She just couldn't believe I didn't know anything about Walt Whitman. I was like, I don't know. That's what this show's about. I'm reading Walt Whitman. So let me read the bio for Walt Whitman, and maybe we can all, maybe I'm not the only one out there who's wholly ignorant to American literature. So, Walt Whitman lived from 1819 to 1892. Was born in West Hills, New York. After leaving school, he undertook a number of occupations, including printer, carpenter, teacher, and newspaper editor. Whitman's most important work, Leaves of Grass, was first published in 1855 as a slim volume containing 12 long poems. Whitman spent much of the rest of his life revising the work, adding and occasionally removing verse. The last edition, published the year before his death, contained nearly 400 poems. In 1862, after his brother George Washington Whitman was wounded in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Whitman volunteered as an army nurse and ministered to soldiers in Washington. That's where the wound dresser stems from. He recorded his wartime experience in Drum Taps, 1865, and Memoranda During the War in 1867. So there you go. There's some great background on Walt Whitman there in a nutshell, especially as it pertains to the wound dresser. Today's poem is much shorter. It is called Cavalry Crossing a Ford. A ford, of course, is it's a river, but I think it's where you cross a river, perhaps. Don't know the exact definition on that. Let me know in the comments below, what is a ford? So this is cavalry crossing a ford. A line in long array where they win. I'm going to start over. A line in long array where they wind betwixt green islands. They take a serpentine course. Their arms flash in the sun. Hark to the musical clank. Behold the silvery river. In it the splashing horses, loitering, stop to drink. Behold the brown-faced men, each group, each person, a picture. The negligent rest on the saddles. Some emerge on the opposite bank, others are just entering the ford. While scarlet and blue and snowy white, the gidden flags flutter gaily in the wind. There you go. Cavalry crossing a ford. I try not to do a lot of research before I read the poems. However, I just couldn't help it a little bit to inform my analysis. Just like one thing off the cuff is that like cavalry crossing a ford. Just super simple yet super descriptive. So you think, okay, maybe the poem will go that way. But his first line is a line in long array where they wind betwixt green islands. That sentence is as far from simplistic as you can get from cavalry crossing a ford. I mean, I messed up the first time I read it. So he does have some depth there. His river is both wide and deep. Walt Whitman. Some Civil War poetry. We will leave Mr. Whitman for today, and we will move to our Confederate poem. It is by a woman named Julia L. Keyes, and she lived from 1829 to 1877. Was a little-known poet from Montgomery, Alabama. She is said to have written Only One Killed after having read the phrase in a newspaper account of an 1864 battle. Following the war, she and her physician husband emigrated to Brazil. Two things. One, Only One Killed is the poem we are reading today. Two, the fact that she moved to Brazil after the war is super interesting. And I just want to again, how does this connect to our current world? If you follow some current events about racial injustice and the Confederate flag and Confederate statues and our nation's reckoning with those symbols of hate, you might have come across news which was news to me, in Brazil today, there's an enormous subculture of Confederate love, and it's insane. Brazilians don't think about it the way we do. Here's why: because after the Civil War, the only country in the world that I believe that had legal slavery was Brazil, and it lasted to 1879. So where did a lot of ex-Confederates go after the war? Well, they went down to Brazil because they could still have slaves. and today, all those descendants live in like a Confederate utopia down in Brazil. It's super weird. They get dressed, they have balls, they have reenactments. It's like Gone with the Wind down there in some communities. And yeah, and apparently Julia Keyes, our poet for today, was one of she started it. So, super interesting. Let's read her poem, shall we? Only one killed. Only one killed. In company B, 'twas a trifling loss. One man. A charge of the bold and dashing Lee, while merry enough it was to see the enemy as he ran. Only one killed upon our side. Once more to the field they turn. Quietly now the horsemen ride, and pause by the form of the one who died, so bravely as now we learn. Their grief for the comrade loved and true for a time was unconcealed. They saw the bullet had pierced him through, that his pain was brief, very brief, die thus on the battlefield. The news has gone to his home afar, of the short and gallant fight, of the noble deeds of the young Lavar, whose life went out as a falling star in the skirmish of that night. Only one killed, it was my son, the widowed mother cried. She turned but to clasp the sinking one who heard not the words of the victory won, but of him who had bravely died. Ah, death to her were a sweet relief, the bride of a single year. Oh, would she might, with her weight of grief, lie down in the dust with the autumn leaf, now trodden and brown and sere. But no, she must bear through coming life her burden of silent woe. The aged mother and youthful wife must live through a nation's bloody strife, sighing and waiting to go. Where the loved are meeting beyond the stars, are meeting no more to part. They can smile once more through the crystal bars, where never more will the woe of wars overshadow the loving heart. So, again, our southern poet is also dealing with some home front woes, showing a little bit of depth to their form. I will say that I think the southern poems I've read deal a lot more with the home front, like mothers and wives waiting for their gallant knights to return or not return, which is interesting. So tomorrow's poetry is going to be the exact same format. Our northern poem is called The Reveille, and it is by Bret Harte. Bret Harte, ladies and gentlemen. And our southern poem is called The Unknown Dead, and that is by Henry Timrod, who has been featured several times on this podcast as well, program, and I've grown to appreciate him. So there you go. The book is Poetry of the Civil War. The show is called Some Civil War Poetry. I am called Vincent Hannum, and you are called faithful supporters. So like, share, subscribe, do all those fun things, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. So long.